So I'm mostly just going to pick up and go back to reading our book, Power of the Powerless, today. Before I jump into that, I'd like to call out a mistake that I made in the last episode when I was describing the book at the beginning. I referenced that it was shaped by the incorrect time frame. It was actually shaped by events that the author of the essay, Vaclav Havel, experienced in the 60s and the 70s. So I think perhaps the reason I did that when I misreferenced the time frame was because of my age. I actually remember very well the fall of the Berlin Wall when I was younger, and that was a big deal. So when I think of uh, Eastern European history, I tend to think of that. However, that was the incorrect time frame in this case. So I did also decide that it looks like I reread the introduction, and the only real opinions come in at the very end, like the last 3 pages, and this is a small book. So I think I'm going to go ahead. Well, I don't think I am going to go ahead and read that introduction because it does add some historical context to the essay itself that I think is important, especially with my limited comprehension of European history. So I'm going to add that this time. And something that was really interesting in realizing my mistake, it actually caused me to think about the time frame more, which I think is interesting as it leans toward a 50, 60-year cycle that I've heard some other people talk about that were in, for example, Bo Polney, that's P like Paul, Olny, if you haven't heard his material. He is called the Analyst of Time. He puts out some very interesting information regarding cycles of time in reference to things he has found in biblical text, which of course I certainly appreciate the Bible. I think it's absolutely one of the most important texts that we have. However, I still have some questions about for example, how it will color our perceptions of the Bible once we get the missing texts back that we now know are available. And I really look forward to that time. I certainly recognize that the creator, source, or God, Yahweh, whatever it is you choose to call source, is greater than all things. Therefore, the biblical text we have may be all we need. However, regardless of what not happened at the Nicene Council, however, I'm still very curious about what those missing books contain and how that will color our perceptions, of course. So I still, my mind starts digging my own little rabbit holes, thinking about, well, cycles of time. What are the bigger cycles of time? The 100-year cycle versus the 50 or 60-year cycle. And if you're not sure what I mean, one of the two things that Bo Polney calls out in some of his time cycle data is when we had Roe v. Wade happen. That was, around 50 years ago. And we also came off the gold standard around 50 years ago. So it's very interesting. I just see a lot of parallels in what Vaclav Havel talks about in his essay in the book, and how people were acting in society, so to speak, and how what we've experienced today and how people are responding to that and how they are acting and feeling and reacting. So I guess that's it, except to say one more thing. I woke up at 4:50 yesterday and I just had a concept stuck in my brain. I couldn't go back to sleep. I don't usually like to get up quite that early. Um, And I think I'm going to do a little skit. There have been times when I have drawn cartoons, and I was thinking it would make a great cartoon. However, that takes time. I don't want to lose the moment because I might not ever share it, and maybe I'm not that funny. I'm probably a little dry. I acknowledge that, but I'll throw it up there. It'll be really short, and then it might be a fun little clip to put out. At any rate, I'm gonna leave that there. Oh, and when I do put that out, I'm not saying it's any kind of woo woo prophetic dream. It's literally satire, just a funny. So I'm going to leave that there, and I will read the book. I'm going to start with the introduction today, a little out of order, but I think my point will be made for my purpose in doing that. I'm just going to leave a little bit out toward the end of the introduction from Timothy Snyder. That's where he really shares some opinions about from the time when he published it was 2018, and he's talking about some major figures in politics and society. And my thought process is that these are very confusing times. The water is already muddy enough. And had, say, this book been published in 2022 instead of 2018, a lot has happened since then. And I'm not so sure that Mr. Snyder's opinions would have been the same. So I I kind of like the idea of leaving that out for now. And so I'm just going to read the introduction without his opinions on people specific to current time frame, not the past, since our entire essay is about that. And I will continue on in the book. So I hope you enjoy, and I will see you soon. Introduction. The Power of the Powerless was a description of resistance to totalitarianism. Its author, Vaclav Havel, thought that it was also a critique of the Western democracy. 40 years after its publication, we see that he was right. Havel was a Czech writing at a particular moment in his country's history, the 1970s, when communism was unbroken gray. The colors had drained away in 1968, though Havel himself was never a Marxist. Czechs and Slovaks of his generation believed that Marx could be invoked to reform and humanize the country's Soviet-style system. In the late 1960s, the Czechoslovak Party leadership believed that socialism with a human face was possible. The Soviet leadership, Leonid Brezhnev in particular, was of another opinion. In August 1968, a Soviet Warsaw Pact invasion dispersed the loose association of Marxists, Democrats, nostalgics, and hippies whose proposals, texts, marches, and happenings were collectively known as the Prague Spring. Like many others, Havel was hopeful during the revolutionary moment, then discouraged by the self-involvement that followed. Rather than seeing his country's situation as exceptional, protesters in Paris or Berkeley, after all, did not have to face Soviet tanks. He chose to see it as typical. Writing The Power of the Powerless a decade after the Prague Spring, Havel was less concerned by Soviet force than by Czechs and Slovaks' evident capacity for adaptation in high politics and in daily life. He was troubled by how the two could merge into what the authorities called normalization. Power was as it was, and alternatives were unthinkable. Thinking was in any event discouraged. Czechoslovak communities had no choice but to accept Brezhnev's doctrine that any reform in a communist country justified Soviet invasion, and followed his line that a consumerist, really existing socialism was as good as things could get. The future disappeared along with belief in Marxism. Czechs and Slovaks were to be diverted by consumer goods, distracted by television series, and demotivated from any sort of action in the public sphere. In the self-violation of society of normalized Czechoslovakia, Havel saw a crisis of contemporary technological society as a whole, a modern unfreedom in which individuals enslaved themselves because they do not ask themselves who they are and what they should be doing. It would thus be wrong to characterize The Power of the Powerless, published illegally in Czechoslovakia and Poland in late 1978, as anti-communist. In the time and place, almost no one was sincerely pro-communist. Normalization meant accepting the way things were, without any argument about how they should be, and it was the suction of the vacuum that troubled Havel the most. Although European and American observers tried at the time, and might still try now, to classify the pamphlet as left-wing or right-wing, Havel was engaging in something more fundamental, a search for a pre-political that would allow people to get out from under ideology as such. Communism was a lie, no longer the Stalinist Big Bang of a sacrifice of millions now for a utopia to come, but instead the normalizer's black hole that everything was how it had to be. For Havel, then, the restoration of civic life began from truth. Havel did not mean a grand truth of some new ideology meant to make sense of everything, nor did he have in mind a beautiful narrative, a national story in which facts and lives could be arranged. He was also not thinking of the objective truth of science or the subjective truth of confession. Each of us is responsible for truth. Havel maintained we cannot delegate that responsibility to an outer world that we imagine to be entirely separate from ourselves, nor to an inner world that we imagine to be completely private. Truth is what moves us in the world and how we move the world back. Truth is unpredictable, for each of us is moved in our own way. Something is true only if it brings you, once in a while, to disturb others. Living in truth, thus, means taking decisions that accord with a personal sense of what matters. You do not know whom your action will touch, but any genuinely meaningful point of departure in an individual's life usually has an element of universality in it. Havel was a failed poet in the 1950s and a successful playwright in the 1960s before he became a dissident in the 1970s. And he displays an artist's attitude toward words. He believed that the wrong words could normalize and that the right words could estrange. That is, enable us to truly see the everyday configurations that we overlook or take for granted. Inhumane language can lull us to sleep, but humane language can awaken us, can help us to recognize that what we have accepted as normal and given is constructed and fragile. The point of an essay such as Power of the Powerless is not to overcome one ideology with another, displace one story with another, overwhelm one emotion with another, or to defeat a specific lie with a specific fact. It is to disenchant the unfree daily world so that we see ourselves and our responsibility with clarity. Havel's reference point in The Power of the Powerless are therefore as quotidian as can be. Brewing beer, playing music, buying groceries, watching television. After the Prague Spring was crushed, and as normalization began, Havel faced the same choice as other Czech and Slovak artists. His plays were no longer performed in Czechoslovakia. Open to him was a self-criticism, a confession of past errors as defined by the regime, and then work for the state, perhaps in television. The rights to Havol's plays had been sold in the West, and so he had some savings that allowed him to defer the choice for a while. He kept away from Prague, where his apartment was bugged and where surveillance was easy, and lived in a country house where he entertained friends. When money grew tight and he had to seek work, almost no one would hire him. Eventually, he took a job in a brewery. That experience helped him return to drama. One of his most famous plays, Audience, of 1975, is about an intellectual who takes a job in a brewery. In The Power of the Powerless, however, the positive hero is not the intellectual who must perform physical labor, but a brewery employee Haval came to know who wants to improve the beer. Haval's colleague knew that it was better to keep his head down, but could not restrain himself from offering advice to his superiors. This was the example Haval gave of what he called living in truth. That the man cared about beer was in some elemental way connected to who he was. Yet beer did not belong only to him, whether it was good or not affected everyone who drank it. Haval called the man the dissident of the Eastern Bohemian brewery. And the gentle irony was meant to suggest a serious point. The sources of dissidence were the authentic aims of life. If beer can be good, it should be good. Such were the minor metaphysics from which a civic life could be built. Haval himself was brought to politics in 1976, quite unpredictably, by the legal defense of a rock band. In communist Czechoslovakia, culture was official. It was legal to play rock and roll music, for example, so long as the group was registered with the authorities. Anyone who was making interesting or provocative music, such as the Plastic People of the Universe, had a difficult time. The Plastics were influenced by the Velvet Underground and the Mothers of Invention. They took their name from the latter band's song, Plastic People. The Plastics and several others were arrested following a performance in March 1976. Haval did not then know much about the group or their music, but saw them as unknown young people who wanted no more than to be able to live within the truth. A protest letter drafted by Haval was distributed illegally in January 1977. Its signatories called the document, and by extension themselves, Charter 77. They appealed to human rights, a concept which, as a result of international agreements, was codified in Czechoslovak law. Haval and other Czechoslovak dissidents met with Polish counterparts at the border in summer 1978. While drinking with his new friends in the mountains, he agreed to write an introduction to a collective book on dissent. This text, The Power of the Powerless, was delivered to Warsaw by underground courier in 1978 and published in the Czech original as Samizdat. Haval was arrested in May 1979 and sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. In The Power of the Powerless, the example of living in truth are actual human beings, such as the brewer and the musicians. They must be, since Haval's idea of truth can only be exemplified by spontaneous individuals who change their surroundings by the actions they take in accord with themselves. Normalization was meant to make such actions impossible and such people unlikable. The Plastics and Charter 77 were mocked in the official mass media as addicted to drugs, mentally ill, and excluded from the national community. Haval intended to expose the abnormality of normalization, to change the semantics of the political drama so that typical behavior seemed absurd and the individuals justified. In his analysis of the communist system, the villain is thus not a real person, but an artistic construct, a nameless greengrocer who hangs a sign in his window that reads, "Workers of the world unite." Havel takes for granted that no one in Czechoslovakia in 1978 cares much about the citation of Communist Manifesto. In normalization, ideology works not as a unifying belief or as an inspiring vision, but as a bridge of excuses between the system and the individual. Thanks to the availability of stock phrases that no one takes literally, the greengrocer can broadcast his obedience, his self-normalization, without having to explicitly acknowledge that he is doing so. He need not hang a sign that reads, "I am obedient and accept others' definition of normality." And the party need not demand that he do so. The greengrocer hangs his sign not because he receives an order, but because he sees that others do likewise. Others in turn follow his example. The system is totalitarian, not because some individual has total power, but because power is shared in conditions of total irresponsibility. There is no clear line between evil and good, power and servitude, party and people, because this line runs de facto through each person. For everyone in his or her own way is both a victim and a supporter of the system. Czechoslovak normalization was, of course, repressive in the expected sense. The brewer, the musician, the signatories of Charter 77, Havel himself were all punished. Yet Havel's point is that normalization is unfreedom because it coaxes you to do the things that you are unreflexively inclined to do anyway. Drink the bad beer that others are brewing. Listen to the bad music that others are playing. Repeat the phrases that others are saying. Normalization speaks to sensibilities that feel personal but are general, suppressing our individuality before it can be expressed in any notable actions. While life ever strives to create new and improbable structures, Havel writes, normalization contrives to force life into its most probable states. Freedom is not doing the things that you are inclined to do. It is reflecting upon what you ought to do as your unrepeatable self, and just occasionally taking a risk and doing that thing. After 1968, the talented writer Jaroslav Dietel, between 1929 and 1985, made a different choice than Havel. Following a public, televised, self-criticism, Dietel was allowed work as a screenwriter for Czechoslovak state television. While Havel wrote for his desk drawer and the plastics played at weddings, Dietel's serials were regularly watched by the absolute majority of the Czechoslovak population. Dietel was the most important normalizer. In his serials, he took policies that would have been portrayed by earlier Stalinists as heroic, such as the collectivization of agriculture or the demolition of old town centers, and turned them into the backdrop of soap operas. He did not, of course, note that collectivization had killed tens of millions of people, nor that historic architecture was the particular beauty of Bohemia. Instead, he made the party members who took over farms or blew up buildings into televisually likable human beings. That such tasks were carried out was somehow inevitable and not really the story. The story was that people who carried them out talked to their fellow Czechoslovaks. Politics, in other words, became a fictive conversation in which the fiction dialogue between a fictional party member and a fictional others took the place of a real public sphere in which actual Czechs and Slovaks might make actual decisions about their countryside or cities. By designing his stories around dramatic human experiences, such as the death of a spouse, Dietel confused the public and the private. The viewer wants a farm to be seized or a building to be dynamited because this is part of a sympathetic character's personal journey. When Dietl's programs aired, the streets of Czechoslovakia emptied. Haval thought that television was making a new animal species out of us, the herded television human. After the spectacular success of Dietl's collectivization series, 1975, in Town Demolition serial, 1976, Haval was defending writing against screenwriting. He meant to show that words on paper could force an individual to see a general predicament, rather than getting lost in a general sentiment. The pre-political began with salvaging unmediated experiences from the wreck of mediated ones. Living in truth, ennobled civic in a country where private and public were confused by television. Dietl died on his tennis court in 1985. Haval became the president of his country in 1990. But the story does not end there. Over the decades, two major objections have been made to Haval's description of totalitarianism and his prescription for a humanizing civic life. With the passage of time, these objections have grown weaker rather than stronger. First, Haval's criticism of technology seemed overwrought in the time and place of its writing. We look on helplessly, he writes, as the coldly fictioning machine we have created inevitably engulfs us, tearing us away from our natural affiliations. Perhaps this overstated the reach of technology in Czechoslovakia in 1978. Today, however, when a single medium, the internet, reaches most human minds, these words seem rather fitting in the West. Rather fitting. In the West, Haval claimed in 1978, people are manipulated in ways that are infinitely more subtle and refined than the brutal methods used under communism. This was hyperbole in 1978, but is certainly true now. After Brexit and other events, we know that surprising results in public life can be attained by psychologists and programmers normalizing the actions of the unwitting. When Haval notes that system contrives to force life into its most probable states, he is with uncanny precision describing the way that social platforms work on the internet. They elicit and affirm our most banal selves. The second objection was that Haval expected too much from his greengrocer. Haval imagined that one day his greengrocer would realize the weight of the responsibility he bore, remove his sign, and so begin the transformation of society. In the reality of communist Czechoslovakia in 1978, such a greengrocer would have been informed upon by his colleagues, neighbors, or some passerby, and punished in a way that would have encouraged conformity. The force of this objection has since dissipated. Like the greengrocer, we put up signs for others to see, generally on the internet. Like the greengrocer, we think little about how doing so contributes to what Haval calls the general panorama. Unlike the greengrocer, we can change what we do without paying a penalty. Collectively, we could also choose to change how the internet functions, again with little or no cost. And most of us can also appear as we like in real life, and for that matter, choose to spend more time in real life. I would like to interject something here briefly. Again, please recall that this book and this introduction was written by Mr. Snyder in 2018. In my personal opinion, we have had a great deal of events happen between 2018 and now in January of 2023 that may have colored the way he wrote this introduction, because now we have seen some of these same things rearing their ugly head. And that's all I have to say. I will continue with the introduction. The objections to Haval's argument disappear when it is applied to our times. Cabal blamed communism in Eastern Europe on our own blindness and weakness as we thoughtlessly produce and accept our own new forms of authoritarianism. The condemnation certainly applies to us. Cabal dictated The Power of the Powerless to Jan Popelka, 1907 to 1977, a Czech philosopher he admired. Like Cabal, Popelka was a spokesman from Charter 77. He died after police interrogation. One of Popelka's students had been the Polish philosopher Rzeszów Michalski, 1948 to 2013. Both Cabal and Michalski like to cite Popelka to the effect, the most interesting thing about responsibility is that we carry it around with us everywhere. Michalski also liked to say that the way to understand a philosophy is to assume that it is correct. That is the way to read The Power of the Powerless. Assume that it is right and watch the world come into focus. I will stop reading the introduction there. There is a bit more, not a lot, but it speaks more of events that occurred in 2018 and not long before that, which seem to, in my opinion, include a lot of colorful, more opinions from the person who republished Václav Havel's essay, Timothy Snyder. So I spoke about that before, so I will stop there and we will pick back up at section 6. Remember, the first 5 sections were read previously in part 1, and you may certainly go back to listen to those if you have not already. 6. Why, in fact, did our greengrocer have to put his loyalty on display in the shop window? Had he not already displayed it sufficiently in various internal or semi-public ways? At trade union meetings, after all, he had always voted, as he should. He had always taken part in various competitions. He voted in elections like a good citizen. He had even signed the anti-charter. Why, on top of all that, should he have to declare his loyalty publicly? After all, the people who walk past his window will certainly not stop to read that. In the greengrocer's opinion, the workers of the world ought to unite. The fact of the matter is, they don't read the slogan at all, and it can be fairly assumed they don't even see it. If you were to ask a woman who had stopped in front of his shop what she saw in the window, she could certainly tell you whether or not they had tomatoes today, but it is highly unlikely that she noticed the slogan at all, let alone what it said. It seems senseless to require the greengrocer to declare his loyalty publicly, but it makes sense nevertheless. People ignore his slogan, but they do so because such slogans are also found in other shop windows, on lamp posts, bulletin boards, in apartment windows, and on buildings. They are everywhere, in fact. They form part of the panorama of everyday life. Of course, while they ignore the details, people are very aware of that panorama as a whole. And what else is the greengrocer's slogan but a small component in that huge backdrop to daily life? The greengrocer had to put the slogan in his window, therefore, not in the hope that someone might read it or be persuaded by it, but to contribute, along with thousands of other slogans, to the panorama that everyone is very much aware of. This panorama, of course, has a subliminal meaning as well. It reminds people where they are living and what is expected of them. It tells them what everyone else is doing and indicates to them what they must do as well, if they don't want to be excluded, to fall into isolation, alienate themselves from society, break the rules of the game, and risk the loss of their peace and tranquility and security. The woman who ignored the greengrocer's slogan may well have hung a similar slogan just an hour before in the corridor of the office where she works. She did it more or less without thinking, just as our greengrocer did, and she could do so precisely because she was doing it against the background of general panorama and with some awareness of it, that is, against the background of the panorama of which the greengrocer's shop window forms a part. When the greengrocer visits her office, he will not notice her slogan either, just as she failed to notice his. Nevertheless, their slogans are mutually dependent. Both were displayed with some awareness of the general panorama, and we might say, under its diktat. Both, however, assist in the creation of that panorama, and therefore they assist in the creation of that diktat as well. The greengrocer and the office worker have both adapted to the conditions in which they live, but in doing so, they help to create those conditions. They do what is done, what is to be done, what must be done, but at the same time, by that very token, they confirm that it must be done in fact. They conform to a particular requirement, and in so doing, they themselves perpetuate that requirement. Metaphorically speaking, without the greengrocer's slogan, the office worker's slogan could not exist, and vice versa. Each proposes to the other that something be repeated, and each accepts the other's proposal. Their mutual indifference to each other's slogans is only an illusion. In reality, by exhibiting their slogans, each compels the other to accept the rules of the game and to confirm thereby the power that requires slogans in the first place. Quite simply, each helps the other to be obedient. Both are objects in a system of control, but at the same time, they are its subjects as well. They are both victims of the system and its instruments. If an entire district town is plastered with slogans that no one reads, it is, on the one hand, a message from the district secretary to the regional secretary, but it is also something more, a small example of the principle of social auto-totality at work. Part of the essence of the post-totalitarian system is that it draws everyone into its sphere of power. Not so they may realize themselves as human beings, but so they may surrender their human identity in favor of the identity of the system. That is, so they may become agents of the system's general automatism and servants of its self-determined goals, so they may participate in the common responsibility for it, so they may be pulled into and enslaved by it, like Faust in Mephistopheles. Faust with Mephistopheles. Apologies, I do not say that very often. More than this, so they may create through their involvement a general norm and thus bring pressure to bear on their fellow citizens. And further, so they may learn to be comfortable with their involvement, to identify with it as though it were something natural and inevitable, and ultimately, so they may, with no external urging, come to treat any non-involvement as an abnormality, as arrogance, as an attack on themselves, as a form of dropping out of society. By pulling everyone into its power structure, the post-totalitarian system makes everyone instruments of a mutual totality, the auto-totality of society. Everyone, however, is in fact involved and enslaved, not only the greengrocers, but also the prime ministers. Differing positions in the hierarchy merely establish differing degrees of involvement. The greengrocer is involved only to a minor extent, but he also has very little power. The prime minister naturally has greater power, but in return he is far more deeply involved. Both, however, are unfree, each merely in a somewhat different way. The real accomplice in this involvement, therefore, is not another person, but the system itself. Position in the power hierarchy determines the degree of responsibility and guilt, but it gives no one unlimited responsibility or guilt. nor does it completely absolve anyone. Thus the conflict between the aims of life and the aims of the system is not a conflict between two socially defined and separate communities, and only a very generalized view, and even that only approximative, permits us to divide society into the rulers and the ruled. Here, by the way, is one of the most important differences between the post-totalitarian system and classical dictatorships, in which this line of conflict can still be drawn according to social class. In the post-totalitarian system, this line runs de facto through each person, for everyone in his or her own way is both a victim and a supporter of the system. What we understand by the system is not, therefore, a social order imposed by one group upon another, but rather something which permeates the entire society and is a factor in shaping it, something which may seem impossible to grasp or define, for it is in the nature of a mere principle, but which is expressed by the entire society as an important feature of its life. The fact that human beings have created, and daily create, this self-directed system through which they divest themselves of their innermost identity is not therefore the result of some incomprehensible misunderstanding of history, nor is it history somehow gone off its rails. Neither is it the product of some diabolical higher will which has decided for reasons unknown to torment a portion of humanity in this way. It can happen, and did happen, only because there is obviously in modern humanity a certain tendency toward the creation, or at least the toleration, of such a system. There is obviously something in human beings which responds to this system, something they reflect and accommodate, something within them which paralyzes every effort of their better selves to revolt. Human beings are compelled to live within a lie, but they can be compelled to do so only because they are in fact capable of living in this way. Therefore, not only does the system alienate humanity, but at the same time, alienated humanity supports this system as its own involuntary master plan, as a degenerate image of its own degeneration, as a record of people's own failure as individuals. The essential aims of life are present naturally in every person. In everyone there is some longing for humanity's rightful dignity, for more integrity, for free expression of being, and a sense of transcendence over the world of existence. Yet, at the same time, each person is capable, to a greater or lesser degree, of coming to terms with living within the lie. Each person somehow succumbs to a profane trivialization of his or her inherent humanity and to utilitarianism. In everyone there is some willingness to merge with the anonymous crowd and to flow comfortably along with it down the river of pseudo-life. This is much more than a simple conflict between two identities. It is something far worse. It is a challenge to the very notion of identity itself. In highly simplified terms, it could be said that the post-totalitarian system has been built on foundations laid by the historical encounter between dictatorship and consumer society. Is it not true that the far-reaching adaptability to living a lie and the effortless spread of social auto-totality have some connection with the general unwillingness of consumption-oriented people to sacrifice some material certainties for the sake of their own spiritual and moral integrity? With their willingness to surrender higher values when faced with the trivializing temptations of modern civilization, with their vulnerability to the attractions of mass indifference, and in the end, is not the grayness and the emptiness of life in the post-totalitarian system only an inflated caricature of modern life in general? And do we not in fact stand, although in the external measures of civilization, we are far behind, as a kind of warning to the West, revealing to its own latent tendencies. I feel like I'm going to stop there for today. I realize I didn't get very far, but I'd like for all of these concepts to sink in. And Václav Havel is quite the wordsmith. He strings together some very intense descriptive words, and sometimes it feels like it's maybe good to let that set in. So I will pick up again next time in chapter 7 or part 7 of the essay, and I will endeavor to come back faster this time. It was the 8 days last time, so I will endeavor to continue recording the reading in the next few days. See you soon.